Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Hot Topic program, Last of the Neanderthals, Their Extinction and Legacy, with Dr. Shara Bailey. My name is Briana Pobiner, and I'm a paleoanthropologist and educator at Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. I'm a brown and gray-haired woman in a dark red shirt, wearing headphones in front of a Zoom screen with an African savanna photo with grass and an acacia tree behind me. Whether this is your first time joining us or you've attended before, we're so glad to have you here. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. This discussion offers closed captioning. You can turn the captions on or off via the CC button, which should be located at the bottom of your Zoom interface. We're in a webinar format, so we can't see or hear you. As you have questions, please go ahead and submit them to the Q&A box, which is at the top or bottom of your screen. It looks like two speech bubbles, so we can sort through as many questions as possible. The Q&A time really flies by. The Q&A box is also where we will share any relevant links during the program, so keep an eye out there. We'll start with an opening presentation by our speaker, Dr. Shara Bailey, and then I'll join her here to take your questions. During the presentation, I will also write answers to some of your questions, at least any that I can answer, as well another member of our behind-the-scenes team, Dr. Ryan McCrae. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Dr. Shara Bailey is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at New York University. Shara is a biological anthropologist whose research focuses on using dental morphology to understand human evolution, especially Middle and Late Pleistocene hominins in Europe and Africa, including Neanderthals. And now I'd like to invite Shara to the screen to give us her presentation.
Thank you, Briana. Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today. I am Shara Bailey. I am a middle-aged woman with blonde curly hair, and I'm coming to you from my home office, which is blurred in the background because it's too messy for everybody to see. I am wearing a dark blazer with a rust-colored shirt. I'm really happy to be here to talk about really one of my favorite topics, which is Neanderthals. My other favorite topic is teeth, and I promise I will pepper this presentation with tidbits on teeth throughout the time we have together. Before we get started, I want to ask you to shut your eyes and use your imagination a little bit. So imagine you're sitting at home one night and there's a knock on the door, and you get up to answer it and see who it is. Or maybe you open up your Ring app to see who it is. But you get there, and standing there is a Neanderthal. What do you see? Are you surprised? Are you scared? If you're like a lot of people, you might conjure up this image of a Neanderthal, something that is kind of stooped over, primitive looking, maybe a little bit sad looking. And if you're gracious, maybe you threw some skins on this individual. Well, over 150 years of research on Neanderthals has helped us change that image. We now know that Neanderthals stood perfectly upright, had very large brains, in some cases larger than ours, and used sophisticated tools. Since their discovery in 1856, Neanderthals have fascinated us, right? Who were they? What were they like? What happened to them? And perhaps, am I part Neanderthal? We're going to get to that at the end, because in fact, most of us who are on this webinar are in fact part Neanderthal. Now, Homo sapiens, us, our species, we think we're pretty special, right? We're here, they are not. Why is that? And we often attribute our success as a species to our intelligence and our cultural sophistication. And there's been really interesting research in the past couple of decades, just even since I started my career in biological anthropology. And this research has shown us, given us some really interesting clues on Neanderthal behavior, and shown us that some Neanderthals may have used red coloring from red ochre or black coloring from manganese to decorate their bodies. Other Neanderthals may have used feathers to decorate their, maybe perhaps in a headdress, and perhaps some used eagle talons and strung them together as some kind of necklace. So this evidence is now suggesting that at least some of the last Neanderthals were capable of some cultural sophistication that we might not have given them credit for in the past. I once had somebody ask me or actually tell me that they heard that you could take all of the human fossils that are out there and put them into a shoebox or a small suitcase. And the thing is, that's not true at all. We have so many fossils. And when it comes to Neanderthals, we have an embarrassment of riches. The earliest Neanderthal discovered in 1856, shown here, was a relatively complete skeleton. But we have others from Israel and from France that are nearly complete skeletons. And we can use the completeness of the fossil record to recreate what Neanderthals looked like. We have Neanderthal infants fossils. We have fossils of old Neanderthals. We have fossils of the Neanderthal ancestors. We have fossils of the last Neanderthals. We have fossils of Neanderthals from France. We have fossils of Neanderthals from Uzbekistan, from Croatia, from Gibraltar, and from Israel. And as you can see on this screen, not all Neanderthals, right? They're in a wide geographic range. They don't all look the same, but they do share certain characteristics. They all have these kind of very large double-arched brow ridges. They have kind of sloping back foreheads. They have rather elongated skulls, sometimes with a kind of protrusion on the back that we call an occipital bun. And they have, if you were to imagine a Neanderthal face, it would be kind of like looking at our face, but grabbing it here in the middle part and pulling it forward so that they have this prognathism that causes their cheekbones to flare forward. They didn't have a chin. They had really wide noses. They also had different teeth. So I could, and I have, given hour-long talks on the teeth of Neanderthals, but I'll focus now just on a few things, specifically the teeth we see when we smile. So those are our incisors. And Neanderthal incisors were pretty incredible. They were very, very curved on the outside, and on the tongue side, they had really marked ridges and tubercles at the base of them, which would have made them pretty sturdy teeth. Below the neck, Neanderthals look different from us. This skeleton shown here is a recreation based on several different Neanderthals. Now, when I was an intern at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, Gary Sawyer, who's responsible for making all those things in the dioramas in the museum, he was working on this skeleton. He's making casts of Neanderthals from all these different sites and putting them together. And he would come in and talk about making this Frankenstein because it was bits and parts of different Neanderthals. And now if you come to New York, you can actually see this Neanderthal skeleton there standing side by side next to a modern human. And when we do that, when we put them side by side, we can see just how different and yet how similar they were. So from the neck down, Neanderthals had very wide, capacious rib cages with a high volume. And those rib cages would have been associated with wide pelvises or hip bones. If we look at their hands and their feet, they were incredibly muscular. And we know that because the muscle attachment sites for their flexor tendons were very strongly marked. Their long bones, their legs and their arms had very, very thick bone on the outer surface, the cortical bone. Their articular surfaces, their joint surfaces were really wide, and their arm bones were a little bit bowed. And all these things suggest a hominin, a human relative that was both bulky and muscular, but also very, very active. Now, if we throw some flesh on a Neanderthal, and put them next to a modern human, you can see there's differences, but they're shorter, they're stockier. You can see how muscular this guy is, but they are still essentially human. So even though Neanderthals are gone, they're not with us anymore, although every once in a while on the subway, I'm like wondering if maybe they still are. They were a very highly successful species, and we need to think of them that way, right? Just because they're not around anymore doesn't mean that they weren't successful. In fact, they had a very wide geographic distribution. They were as far west as Portugal, and they were as far east as the Altai region of Russia. You can see their sites here on the map on the screen, showing them all over Europe, in Italy, in Greece, in the Caucasus, in Israel, right, in Uzbekistan, out there in Russia. So they had a wide geographic distribution. They also existed for a long period of time. The earliest Neanderthal fossils date to about 400,000 years ago. We know there are Neanderthals. They don't look exactly like Neanderthals of let's say 200, 300,000 years later, but their DNA is shared with Neanderthals, which shows a very definite link. These are from Cima de los Huesos in Spain. We also have evidence of them existing up until 40,000 years. So they existed for 400,000 years. And some of these last Neanderthals, the one on the right here is from France, and it's been nicknamed Thorin, also have DNA that's very interesting. And in this particular case, the lineage that Thorin was part of did not contribute to modern humans. So the more we have evidence, the more we gather data, we know that there's a very complex picture of the relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans. But they were successful. They lived for a long period of time. In fact, they were on Earth longer than we have been on Earth. And during that time period, that 400-year time period, 400,000-year time period, they went through, just marked climatic fluctuations and challenges. Every time there were glacial periods, you can see in this graph here on the left, what I'm graphing is 400,000-year period on the left up until today. We're in a warm period today, but you can see the fluctuations in climate as you move through time. And those little snowflakes indicate glacial periods that Neanderthals lived through. Now, during interglacial periods, these are warmer periods, and glacial periods, the colder periods, the landscape would have changed dramatically. So the image on the top is what the landscape might have looked like for Neanderthals during a cold period. You see an open steppe grassland. We see megafauna, woolly mammoth, woolly rhino. In the warmer interglacial periods, that same landscape would look very differently. Now we have a water hole with some hippo and hyenas and trees lining the water. And so Neanderthals right, their food resource base would have changed with the changes in the climate. And these marked changes, that the variability, the instability, the colds and the warms, they would have placed really remarkable selection pressures on Neanderthals. So Neanderthals had to adapt, and they did so successfully. They adapted through biology. So as we saw an image of Neanderthal earlier, this one here is showing you this short and stocky build with shorter distal limb segments, meaning like the forearm and the lower leg relative to the other parts of the limbs. These things would have reduced the surface area relative to body mass and would have helped them insulate them and retain their body heat. So it was a cold adaptation. They're really big noses, which were wide but also stuck out, would have possibly been selected to help them humidify cold, dry air. It would also have helped them in a very active lifestyle that they lived, helping them get oxygen, right, to all the parts of the body they need to. Now, when we look at other ways Neanderthals adapted, there's certain things we can tell from the fossils and certain things we can't. We can't tell things like skin color, hair color, and pigmentation from the actual fossils, but we can get clues about that from their DNA. And what's interesting is, again, Neanderthals were highly variable. They didn't all look the same. So what this map is showing you is modern human skin pigmentation around the world. And in modern humans, living humans today, people who live closer to the equator have darker pigmentation than people who live farther away from the equator. And this is the result of a selection balancing selection for having enough UV radiation, but not too much. So too much ultraviolet radiation can cause skin cancer and folate destruction that can affect fertility, and not enough ultraviolet radiation, on the other hand, can lead to a disease called rickets because we need ultraviolet radiation to synthesize vitamin D. Vitamin D helps make our bones strong. Vitamin D is also important in DNA repair. And so you need to make enough vitamin D, and we need the sunshine, we need ultraviolet light to do that. So when you move farther from the equator, if you have darker skin, there's selection against that so that you can get more UV radiation. Anyway, what's interesting is that when we look at Neanderthals, they also had a range in skin pigmentation. Some Neanderthals have genetic variants that may have resulted in fair skin, perhaps freckling and red hair. And other Neanderthals had genetic variants that would have been related to darker pigmentation. So again, not all Neanderthals looked the same. So they were variable on their landscape. Beyond biology, Neanderthals adapted to their environments through their culture. Now, if we look at a distribution of Neanderthal sites on this map here, the blue triangles are Neanderthal sites. We see that they some of them are distributed above 40 degrees latitude, which is the location of present-day Madrid, Spain, around here. So this is 40 degrees. So we find their sites above that. And people who have looked at humans who live above 40 degrees latitude today note that above that latitude, you must cover your body with some type of clothing. And so we can infer that Neanderthals, in fact, wore some clothing, more so in some areas and less so in others. And we have archaeological evidence for tools that they may have used to put holes into skins to make clothing, like the awl that's on the right of your screen. So Neanderthals used culture to adapt to their environment. They wore some types of clothing, probably where they lived, they would have had to cover about 40% of their body. So basically throwing on, kind of a skin over your shoulders and then something tied around your waist. What's interesting is if we look at the teeth again, we can see also most Neanderthals have worn down their front teeth extensively, especially when you compare that tooth wear to the back of the mouth. So this individual in the lower right-hand corner shows, if you look at his front teeth, you can see there is no white present. That's because this individual is chewing on the roots of his teeth. Ow, right? But you can look at his molars in the back there, and there's still a lot of tooth enamel. The reason for that is that they were using their front teeth as third hands or as a tool. They may have been using them as in the kind of stuff and cut method where you're holding a piece of meat and then you're cutting it with a stone tool before you eat it, cutting a piece off. But also ethnographic studies suggest that Neanderthals might have been using their front teeth to soften skins, right, to use for clothing. We know that because people who live in very cold Arctic climates now, or at least in the recent past, will chew on skins using their front teeth to soften them. So we suspect that Neanderthals likely did that as well. And when skins weren't enough, Neanderthals built fires. There's these preservation of manganese oxide in a site called France that dates back about 50,000 years ago. Neanderthals could have used these to help start fires. When we look at many Neanderthal sites, we see evidence of hearths, right? The round circle shapes where there's ash in there, and we'll see multiple layers of ash over time. So this suggests that not only could Neanderthals control fire, but they also knew how to make it. Interestingly, there's this site here, these images on the right are of a site called Bruniquel in France. This site dates to about 170,000 years ago, probably Neanderthals. And what's interesting about it, well, there are a number of things that are interesting about it, but it's made up of a bunch of broken stalagmites put in kind of an unnatural pattern, as you can see here. But many of those stalagmites have red and black streaks on them indicating burning. And there are also animal bones associated with these stalagmites deep in this cave that suggests burning as well. Perhaps they were cooking a meal or using it for some kind of ritual purposes. Now, we shouldn't be we shouldn't be surprised that Neanderthals are found in caves. I mean, right, they're cavemen. But what is surprising is the extent to which they modified their environment, in this case, breaking off stalagmites and organizing them in these patterns. Stone tool technology is another way Neanderthals would have adapted culturally. Homo erectus, that predates Neanderthals, used pretty nice stone tool technology, but with their technology making hand axes and cleavers, what you had is kind of a one-to-one correspondence between a piece of rock and the stone tool that was made from it. The difference with Neanderthals and also later with modern humans is that you can make many stone tools from one piece of rock, right? So in this case, we're looking at something called a prepared core technique, or a leva technique. Using this technique, Neanderthals would take a piece of rock, they would prepare it by flaking around the edges, knocking off flakes on the top, on the bottom, and then they would turn it and then knock a flake off. And that's what you see in the middle, a leva flake. And you can see on the left a flake being refit into its core. Now, after that flake was made, they can reshape the core and make another one. And they can make a series of flakes that look pretty much uniform and are very similar. And that's great if you want to be using them as a spear point, for example, and you want all those spear points to be similar in size and shape. And we can see those on the right. On the lower right-hand corner of your screen is a really interesting new find that was discovered on a beach in the Netherlands. And what's interesting about this is it's a lava flake, but you can see that there's actually pitch tar adhesive stuck to that flake. So, back 20 years ago, we didn't know if Neanderthal hafted these stone tools to spears, and now we know for sure that they did. We have the adhesive that they used. Now, the thing about this adhesive is that it took a long time to prepare, many days to prepare. So it would have taken forethought and planning and also patience to make this adhesive, which is made from birch pitch. Now, Neanderthals could have and did make these spear points out of these lava flakes, but they also modified them for scraping and for digging and for making holes in skin. So it's, useful for a lot of different uses. So Neanderthals were no dummies, just as the Geico commercials remind us. They were pretty smart cookies. There's other proof that Neanderthals were no dumb brutes, and that might come from possibly evidence of symbolic thought, maybe, in the context of burials. Now, almost every Neanderthal that's been discovered it's been suggested that they that it represents a burial. How can we tell? We can look at the position of the body. For example, in these two that I have up on the screen now, the body is flexed, which is not a natural position. Sometimes we find Neanderthals associated with what might be called grave offerings. So, for example, at a site in Uzbekistan, there are ibex horns associated with a child's skeleton. And here in Syria, the Dedaria child is also found with a stone near its head, but also a flint point in its chest area. But what's more remarkable to me than these possible grave offerings is just the preservation of Neanderthal children, and we have a lot of them. So the Dedaria child is about 19 months old, and the one next to it here in the image on the far left is from a site called Mezmeskaya, and that's a newborn infant. But look at the preservation. There's finger bones, there's rib bones, right? There's all the bits and pieces still preserved of these very, very young children. And the thing is, the children bones are friable. They're very fragile. So the fact that we find them bones and we find them in articulation, right, connected to one another, and we find these skeletons so incredibly complete suggests that they were covered up very quickly after they died, and that would have protected them from scavengers. Now, whether that was done with some kind of ritualistic purpose or whether that was done just to, keep the smell down and keep the scavengers away, it's hard to really know. And it's an active debate within paleoanthropology. But not found with burials, but intriguing nonetheless. We have some possible evidence that Neanderthals had symbolic thought through possible pieces of art. So this hand axe here, which is actually 300,000 years old, probably made by Neanderthals or their ancestors, is very interesting because the maker of this hand axe obviously had some appreciation for the fossil shell that's right in the middle, right? They flaked around that shell very purposefully. The person who made this, who put red ochre on this shell and poked holes into it and possibly used it as a pendant 100,000 years ago must have had, some appreciation for aesthetics. This piece of rock that has these parallel and curved lines could be additional evidence of Neanderthals expressing some kind of symbolic thought. These hand prints that are from Portugal that are about 60,000 years old might be representative of Neanderthal symbolic thought. Some 40,000 years ago, somebody stuck a bone splinter in a piece of rock, and perhaps they thought it looked kind of like a mask. This is from France. And in Slovenia, around the same time period, some person modified a juvenile bear bone with holes and possibly used it as a flute. So what's interesting is that what I have up on the screen is pretty much all the evidence that we have of symbolic, the use of symbolism in Neanderthals in the form of art. Now, there are those feathers that I mentioned, and there are some eagle talons that may have been strung together as a necklace. But besides those, so we have about 8 things, we don't really see a lot of evidence of art with Neanderthals. The thing I think we need to keep in mind is that it's very possible that you had Neanderthals come up with this idea and share it with members of their group. Maybe their members of the group appreciated it, maybe they didn't. But Neanderthals lived in very small groups, sparsely on the landscape. They didn't have long distance trade networks. They probably didn't encounter other groups very often, and they most certainly didn't share a language with the other groups, Neanderthal groups that are around, because they didn't come in contact very often. And I think we would all agree that one thing that leads to exponential growth in technology is new ideas coming together, right? Somebody has an idea, somebody's like, oh, that's great, but you could do this a little bit better, or how about if you did this, right? And if you are in a small groups and maybe your peeps appreciate you, maybe they don't, right? You can have great ideas that just actually don't go anywhere or don't get spread very far. And the other thing that I want to point out about this possible Neanderthal art is that most of it occurs with the last Neanderthals. These are Neanderthals that probably were in contact with modern humans. So it's hard to know if they came up with it on their own or if they were copying from what modern humans were doing, because we know modern humans made flutes from ivory and from bird bones and painted caves and all these things. So Neanderthals were successful. They adapted culturally and biologically. But there were a lot of challenges, right? And one of them, again, the big challenge is related to climate change and what that did to their environment. So Neanderthals ate a lot of meat. Well, we know that from their isotopic values, which is what this graph is showing you on the screen now. Early Upper Paleolithic modern humans also ate a lot of meat. They were big game hunters, but they also ate wild plants. For example, barley, and some of those plants they would have cooked. So their diet wasn't extremely narrow, but they did rely a lot on hunting. And the hunting that Neanderthals did was ambush hunting, so hiding and then, surprise attacks on an animal. They weren't hunting from long distances. The weapons they used, the spears they used, were thrusting spears. And these spears would have had to have been used very up close and personal with large, dangerous animals. They hunted both medium and large-sized animals. And most of the Neanderthal skeletons that we have some evidence of healed fractures. That together with the thrusting spears and the the muscle markings we see on their bones that show them they were very active people suggests that yeah, hunting was a big part of their life, and they were very well adapted to it. But when we see that when the climate changes, right, they're hunting territories. Shown here in the upper right-hand corner in green are your forested areas where Neanderthals would have done most of their hunting. That's during interglacial period. But when we switch to a glacial period, right, you can see the white expanding. That's a big glacier up north expanding. You can see that those forests shrink, right? And Neanderthals disperse into refugia. They're following their game into these shrinking forested areas. What is in between now are grasslands, open spaces that Neanderthals are less well adapted to exploit. And we know that these changes affected Neanderthals and were stressful because we see lines in their teeth where their teeth actually stopped growing in response to nutritional stress. So a lot of Neanderthals have these lines that suggest that they were undergoing a very stressful period. But, right, they made it through. Right, I showed you that timeline and all those dips where there were glacial periods. Neanderthals, locally, their populations went extinct, but they came back, they bounced back. But that changed about 40,000 years ago. Around 40,000 years ago, it was a colder period. The climate was changing fairly rapidly, maybe significantly within one Neanderthal's lifetime, for example. The environment would have changed very dramatically, and it took its toll. So we can see here this graph, the temperature of the past 50,000 years. We can see we're in a very warm period now. And Neanderthals disappeared somewhere around 40,000 years ago, which I mentioned is kind of a cooler period where there's a lot of fluctuations. The landscape might have looked something like this. But what the difference is that 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals didn't bounce back, right? After that time period, they disappeared. The difference is, and we can see this from the map again, this map again of Neanderthal and Homo sapien sites, we can see that Homo sapiens, these red dots, are now in Neanderthal territory by this time. They're occupying the same areas. We find them at sites interstratified. So you have Neanderthals, modern humans, right, over time. There's some sites where you have Neanderthals, modern humans, then Neanderthals again, and they're not the modern humans were not successful, right? So there's variation in the degrees to which they were successful. But these modern humans coming from Africa that were successful, and remember, these aren't the first humans out of Africa. The first humans out of Africa, well, the very first ones weren't successful. We have their remains in Greece at 200,000 years ago, in Israel 180,000 years ago, but they disappear. It's not until after 60,000 years ago that humans really are able to lock in and to disperse to other areas of the world. And they get to Europe relatively late compared to Australia and Asia. And probably it's because Neanderthals were already there. But they did eventually outcompete Neanderthals. And probably part of the reason is that they had better technology. And one of the examples of their better technology is these split bone points that would have been lighter, easier to replace. If you spear something and it gets stuck, you can pull out your wooden spear and just replace the point very easily. But also these archaeological evidence for long distance hunting. So what you're seeing on the screen here are spear throwers. Now, spear thrower, essentially an atlatl or spear thrower, extends your arm, and it allows you to hunt from longer distances and also and throw a spear with greater velocity. Now, remember the map I showed you with the Neanderthal territory shrinking, the forest shrinking and the grasslands expanding. So modern humans coming into that area who are already equipped for long distance hunting would have very easily been able to outcompete Neanderthals. They would have occupied areas Neanderthals weren't able to exploit. They would have increased in number. And then when they expanded into Neanderthal territory, they could have very easily swamped them. And in fact, that's what we see. The other thing that probably helped the success of our species is culturally the invention of the bone needle. So as I showed you before, Neanderthals had these tools that they could use to make holes in skins, and that would have allowed them to live, in areas above 40 degrees latitude, but they didn't get above 50 degrees latitude. So in the upper left-hand corner, we see Neanderthal sites in that kind of orange and red zone. Those are temperate areas. So even though they were cold adapted, they still stayed in more temperate areas. We don't find their sites in the northern areas, the blue areas. Compare that to the lower right-hand corner where we see upper Paleolithic modern human sites, and you can see they're all over. They're up in those higher latitudes. They're up in areas where you'd have to cover 80 to 90% of your body with clothing, and the bone needle allowed them to make tailored clothing that would have allowed them to make hats and gloves and mittens and things that would have covered the amount of body to reduce the amount of exposure that they had. So eventually, we saw that the Neanderthal range was quite wide, but the Homo sapiens range, the upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens range, was much wider. And in just about 10,000 years of arriving on the scene, Neanderthals disappear. But right, we know that they still exist in parts in all of us outside of Africa. They have left a legacy. Svante Pääbo, here shown on the right from the Max Planck Institute, has spent his entire career perfecting the use of ancient DNA and ways to extract DNA from ancient fossils, pushing that back now to 400,000 years ago. What we've learned is that all of us outside of Africa have between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. There is some Neanderthal DNA within Africa. It's probably due to admixture with non-Africans. And there are other archaic DNA in Africa, but Neanderthal DNA is in everybody, 1% to 4% outside of Africa. And you can buy a kit. Maybe you want to do it for Christmas. You can swab your mouth. You can send a saliva sample, and you can find out how much Neanderthal DNA you are. And the thing is that even if you're Jeremy, who has 96% more Neanderthal DNA than most of 23andMe's customers, that might tell us something, but it doesn't tell us about what Jeremy would have looked like. We don't know, or we have not yet identified any Neanderthal genes that would be used to code for those big brow ridges or the face, or the lack of a chin. How we got that Neanderthal DNA probably goes back pretty far in time to the first successful excursions of modern humans out of Africa. They probably would have interacted and met with Neanderthals in the Near East, in Israel, Iraq, Syria. They would have exchanged genes, and then those modern humans would have expanded out, carrying those Neanderthal genes with them. And what did those Neanderthal genes do? Well, they actually helped us survive. So even though it's only 1% to 4% Neanderthal DNA in modern humans, which doesn't necessarily seem significant, it was significant because their genes allowed us to adapt much more quickly than we would have otherwise. So there are areas of the human genome where Neanderthal genes are enriched, and there's places where there's pretty much the Neanderthal deserts, but the areas where they're enriched are linked to immunity. So Neanderthal DNA may have helped us adapt, or our immune system may have helped our immune system detect bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens. The other Neanderthal DNA that's enriched is related to skin and hair. And so you can imagine them kind of giving us a jump start on our adaptation to this very new environment. So they're gone, but their legacy lives on in all of us, and we should thank them for what they have done for us as a species. And I will end there and thank all of you for your attention, and I welcome any questions that you have.
That was wonderful, Shara. Thank you so much. And we actually have a bunch of questions that have come in already, so I will dive right in.
Great.
So the first question comes from Tad, who says, hello, as Dr. Pobiner perhaps recalls, I'm interested in the origins of war. I also know how brutal and murderous Homo sapiens have been to other Homo sapiens, like in the last 100 years. Although many other explanations might be advanced for the extinction of Neanderthals, isn't it possible one explanation that our brutal ancestors 35,000 years ago or so made war on them and exterminated them, killed them all off?
That is such a great question. And it's a question that we can actually get at a little bit from the fossil record. So if you think about what kind of evidence we would look for, right, we might look for evidence of injuries, right, of people having smashed in heads or, spear points in the ribs and things like that. And we don't really see a lot of evidence of that. We do see some evidence of interpersonal violence, but it predates Homo sapiens moving in. So there is a skeleton from Iraq that has a spear point actually embedded in a rib, but this one predates when Homo sapiens would have been there. And I think that, I try to avoid any kind of simplistic explanation for the extinction of Neanderthals. And I suspect that in some places there was violence and there was, warfare against Neanderthals, or the other way around. That might be why modern humans couldn't make successful excursions into Europe right away, because the Neanderthals were successful in pushing them back. But at some point they were able to get in. And it's probably a combination of competing for their same resources, probably some violence, probably some spreading of pathogens. So I think it's a very complicated picture, but it's a really good question.
No, it makes good sense. And actually, someone else had just asked, is there any indication of fighting among the Neanderthals, which you basically answered that.
And they sometimes were eating each other too, right? So
yeah. So wait, so talk about that for a minute.
yeah, so there's a number of Neanderthal sites where we have evidence of humans modifying other human bones. So, right, we weren't there. We don't know if they actually ate them. We don't know if it's ritualistic, but there are definitely cut marks on, for example, on mandibles from Spain, from Croatia. There are arm and leg bones that have been splintered apart, and the bone marrow has been taken out. So and it's not terribly rare. So
yeah, thank
always
you.
nice.
That's right. So Walter asks, I'm interested in the children burials. Were the newborns wrapped or associated with flowers or other gifts? Did the Neanderthals seem to have separated burial sites like cemeteries?
Oh, a really good question. So those kinds of things don't preserve in the fossil record or the archaeological record in terms of like wrapping a child up. Those particular baby burials are individual ones. They're not buried next to any other ones. There is a site in France, La Ferracie, where there's I believe eight? Well, there's a number of individuals. I'm trying to count like the specimen numbers in my head. So I think there's at least eight individuals from La Ferracie. Some of them are children. And, some people have argued that it was an intentional burial area. It's always hard to tell because the resolution that we have in terms of dating isn't in the tens of years. It's in the hundreds of years. So it's always hard to know where the things were buried exactly at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Here's an interesting question from Niels, who asks, was the relative lack of Neanderthal expansion into Africa due more to the environment there or the inability to compete with Homo sapiens?
That's a really good question too. So why didn't Neanderthals get into Africa? Yeah, it could be because Homo sapiens was there. It could be because of their particular adaptations and they were, fine where they are. I think part of the reason that Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa is because of growth in population, right? So if Neanderthals were doing fine and they're small they're small groups and they're doing okay and there's no reason to, continue moving and to get to Africa, of course, right, you'd have to go through the Near East, right? So there could have been some exchanges there. We just haven't detected it yet. Otherwise, they would have had to cross over the Mediterranean because there was never a time period where Europe would have been attached by a landmass to Africa. So that would have been part of the reason why. And, and maybe it's just something about the cultural sophistication of modern humans or their need to meander down but that's a really good question, Neil.
So here's a question from Audrey, and it would be great to clarify this. She asks, is there no Neanderthal DNA in Africa or Asia? I think she means like modern Africans or like living Africans or Asians.
There's actually more Neanderthal DNA in modern Asians than there are Europeans, so slightly more. Everybody outside of Africa has between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. In
Mm-hmm.
Africa, there are now, we know, this is in the past 10 years, that there are some living Africans that have Neanderthal DNA, but we think that it's because of admixture from European, like living modern Europeans, right? Rather than from intermixing with Neanderthals. It's very, very, very few. It's
Mm-hmm.
under 1% Neanderthal DNA, so it's very little.
So it sounds like Neanderthals and modern humans in Europe mixed, and then the living modern humans that are those descendants then sort of interbred with living Africans. And so that's how that Neanderthal DNA.
Yeah, because they
Okay.
definitely intermixed in the Near East when those people very easily
Hmm.
go back into Africa and intermix with African populations.
Yeah.
So yeah, so probably the major intermixing event they think happened in the Near East, right?
Hmm.
East, and then those people spread those genes outward, and there might have been occasional other intermixing. So it's interesting.
Hmm.
People have modeled that it would have only taken one mating every 30 to 50 years to get the amount of Neanderthal DNA we see in all living humans today. That's not a whole lot. But we have to keep in mind that when we say one mating in every 30 to 50 years, we mean one successful mating. Because
Mm,
a lot of those matings probably were not successful, meaning their offspring didn't survive or their offspring weren't fertile because they were very close to being different species if they weren't already.
right. Thank you. Here's an interesting question from Jose. Is there any evidence that Neanderthals domesticated canines as pets?
Oh, such a good question. No, but canines, dogs were domesticated fairly early.
Mm,
And I can't remember. There's actually a recent paper out on that I think pushes their domestication back to, maybe 20 or 30,000
30, I think. Yes,
being
around there. Hmm.
with Homo sapiens. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. All right, there's a couple questions about sort of symbolism. And so Jose also asks, is there any art of megafauna that they, meaning Neanderthals, painted in caves, or were those mostly from Cro-Magnon, sort of early Homo sapiens individuals?
Yeah, the only cave art we have of Neanderthals, maybe Neanderthals, and I say maybe because there are no Neanderthal fossils associated with the cave art. They're assumed to be made by Neanderthals because of their date.
Hmm.
They predate Homo sapiens, but 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 very recently we have found out that Homo sapiens actually made excursions much earlier, right? So I don't know all that. Anyway, um, back to the question. The only Neanderthal cave art we have are the handprints I showed you, and there's one cave that has some abstract line pattern,
Hmm.
also around 60,000 years ago. So there's no megafauna at all. No.
Okay. Yeah, somebody had asked about the La Pasiega. So is
Right.
that geometric art?
That's
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Um, and looks like, hold on a second. Gerald asks, is Brunikel Cave evidence of symbolic thought?
A good question. I know. I mean, do we if we're going to apply the same standard to every hominin, then yeah, I guess it is
Hmm.
intentional. They're making the thing about, again, with Brunikel. So again, we know that Homo sapiens were in Greece by 200,000 years ago. We know they were in Israel by 180, and we know they were in France, and then displaced by Neanderthals in France 50,000 years ago. So I think I'm just always a little skeptical, because it's always possible that some of these humans got into places, did their kind of creative thing, because we have
Mm,
evidence early in Africa, up to 500,000 years ago, of people doing modern things. So the modernity is in Africa way before humans leave. So it's very possible, that the people who did the Brunical thing could have been Homo sapiens. And we don't have Neanderthal fossils or Mousterian. I don't know. I don't think there are any Mousterian tools, but even if they were, Homo sapiens used Neanderthal tools too. So it's a little bit muddy.
no, it's a good cautionary, thing that we have to keep in mind. So thank you for that. So here's a question from Urate who asks, how do you tell when or if Neanderthal cannibalism is associated with intentional killing or just eating of already dead individuals, for example, in cases of starvation?
You can't really tell. Yeah. I mean, aside
Yeah.
from, having a head on a stake or something, that's very obvious. Yeah, and so we don't know whether the cannibalism was ritualistic or just evidence that Neanderthals were really stressed sometimes
Mm-hmm.
these cold periods, and they ate what they had to eat. But we don't know if the people were dead already and then just eaten, or if and it wasn't just Neanderthals. If people 800,000 years ago in Spain at Grandolina did it too. In fact, every single human bone from Grandolina has cut marks on it. So
Wow.
yeah.
So speaking of Spain, actually, Urate also asks, is the origin of Neanderthals now thought to be in Spain at the Cueva de Huesos?
Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I I would say certainly those are at Cima de los Huesos, those are definitely Neanderthal ancestors. I
Mm-hmm.
hesitate because we don't know, and
Mm-hmm.
because the Grandolina material also in the same cave system, which is
Mm-hmm.
800,000 years old, which is about the time period when we'd expect to see the split in Neanderthals and modern human lineages. There's some aspects of their teeth that there's one aspect of a couple teeth that look Neanderthal-y. I'm not even sure if those are already on the lineage to be Neanderthals. Or we have some fossils that actually we're describing with Rick Potts at the Smithsonian that from Africa that could represent that kind of common ancestor and the beginnings. But I do think Neanderthals evolved in Europe, and it's, the evidence we have now might place that origin in Spain. Yes.
Thank you. And stay tuned for that was a fun tidbit. Um, and so Urati also asks, weren't the last known Neanderthals in Spain, not France?
There's a number of sites,
Mm-hmm.
and the dating. So there was one in Spain called from Zafaria,
Mm-hmm.
uh, that has been redated, and it's older. It was thought at one point to be 28
Ah.
years, and so a lot of the last Neanderthals from a cave in Croatia called Vindia,
Mm-hmm.
the Mesmeskaya from the Caucasus, Zafaria from Spain. They were all thought to be around 28,000 or 30,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And they've all been pushed back to be about 40. So they're in the same time range. Mhm.
I do remember that when that happened because we actually went through in the Hall of Human Origins at the Smithsonian and like updated everywhere where we had said that earlier date and made, sorry, that later date, and now it's corrected it to be a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
Um, so Terry asks, can you guess how many males versus females there were, or were there more males versus females? Like, do we have a sense of that?
Well, anytime that so at Cima de los Huesos, we have a lot of individuals, like 30 individuals of the
Mm-hmm.
early Neanderthals, and there's an equal representation of males and females.
Okay.
The best site we have that has numerous individuals that we could even, try to guess of what that distribution would be, but probably the same number of males and females. What's interesting is even though we all have Neanderthal DNA, that DNA is from the nucleus of the cell. Modern humans don't have any Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA. And the mitochondrial
Mhm.
DNA, so this is DNA in these little organelles that are in all of our cells. It's much more simple, but it's only inherited along the mother's line. So that
Mhm.
would suggest if we do not have any maternal Neanderthal DNA, that the intermixing between Neanderthals and modern humans, or at least the successful ones, were between the Neanderthal males and Homo sapiens females.
Okay. Oh, thanks. Um, so here's one of our behind the scenes questions about Neanderthal cold adaptations. So the question is, having adaptations to the cold doesn't necessarily mean that those traits evolved in response to the cold. Do you think they specifically evolved to be cold adapted, or maybe they co-opted these traits to exist in colder climates? Is there a way to tell about that?
Hmm. Now, that's a good question. I don't really know how to answer that.
Mhm.
You'd have to go back and have a good record of their ancestors and to see if you have a gradual,
Mhm.
evolution of these features. And, the evolution of so the people that predated Neanderthals, not just at Cima de los Huesos, but multiple sites in Europe. Um,
Mhm.
these cold adaptive. Well, I'm thinking of the face, right? Not body proportions, but they show up here and here and here, and there's not necessarily a linear progression. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether these are actually cold adaptations or whether they're just a result of genetic drift, which is just chance change, just because the populations are small and, something gets kind of stuck by chance. But the nose, the nose and the nose is, again, one of those ones. It could be for adaptation to high activity, or it could be cold adaptation. The limb proportions, that it's pretty much what we see in all mammals, right? In relationship to where they are found latitudinally and related to the environment. So I think at least some of it would have been selected for cold adaptation.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Here's an interesting question from Jose. Do we have any idea about what predator preyed most on Neanderthals?
Unlike Australopithecus africanus, where we have one, which is like 3 million years ago, where we have a skull with with marks from the canines of a large cat. We don't have any Neanderthal skeletons that have obvious marks on them from any kind of predator. So I'm really not sure.
Yeah, that's a great question. Urate asks, you mentioned that there were cultural differences between geographic Neanderthal groups. Could you give some examples of these cultural differences?
Well, I mean, I think mostly I was pointing out that the physical differences, that they don't all look alike. But in
Okay.
terms of cultural, differences, they all use the Mousterian tools and the Levallois tool technique, but there are certain toolkits that are, found in France, the Lakina
Right.
toolkit, and they look different from the Silezian, or not, that's modern humans, but the other Neanderthal toolkits used in Central Europe associated with the Quapina Neanderthals. And so, and what does that look like? It's mostly just different frequencies of types of tools, and
Okay.
perhaps some differences in how they were made. Yeah.
So it doesn't sound like sort of major differences. And like you mentioned, the eagle talons here and like a couple, of those hints of symbolic behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I think there were probably Neanderthal geniuses out there and nobody got them, and they were just like, go stop messing with feathers or something. And they weren't appreciated. And then, because I really do think the population size had something to do with that the great ideas weren't able to get passed on and get built upon, because their
Yeah.
technology, the Mousterian, it doesn't really change over time, not until they developed the Chatel-Perronian toolkit, which is associated again with modern humans coming into Europe. And so probably a response to either copying what modern humans were doing, or a response like, oh my God, that's a them. Now we have to become a us and develop something unique and different, to identify as part of our identity. I don't know.
Yeah. So we have time for one or two more questions. So this follows nicely on what you were just mentioning. Urate asks, did they use bone tools?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay.
They did. They used bone tools. Um, Antler, less so. I
Okay.
can't think of an example of antler, but I don't want to say they didn't because I'm probably wrong. And if they did, it would have been just the last Neanderthals. So when they start
Okay.
like bone and antler and things like that, it's always these last ones, the 40 right before they go extinct.
Okay.
I mean, but
Interesting.
you can use a bone to dig in the ground, and even Australopithecus did that. So, so it kind of depends on what you're imagining in your head.
Yeah. Do we know, Jose asks, did Neanderthals ever use traps for prey?
So that's also difficult to know, but there was I think at this site, I think it's Mandran, which there's a site in France that dates about, I think it's one of these last Neanderthal sites where they have preservation of 3-ply cord at this site, which is really unique and very rare. I mean, I'd say that's the first time I ever heard of that. And they hypothesize that it may have been used for making a trap, but it could have also been used for clothing, so we're unsure.
I am going to take the opportunity to ask the last question, which is, it's probably too big a question, but what are some key questions about Neanderthals that you feel like remain unanswered, or maybe one key question that you would like to see answered, and how would researchers go about answering it?
Um, that's a good question because, we've come such a long way. I mean, I started my
Mm-hmm.
dissertation, the big question was whether or not well, I mean, when I started my dissertation, the question was whether we evolved from Neanderthals, which we didn't, right? But then it became,
Mm-hmm.
well, did we actually interbreed with them? And I think that most of the interesting questions are unfortunately not going to come from teeth, except for the DNA we extract from them. But it's going to
Mm-hmm.
be, I'm really looking forward to seeing as what they learn about what the Neanderthal genes code for. I mean, right now we know that the ones that modern humans have, at least some of them code for the immune system or hair and skin and stuff. But um, I'm interested in the degree to which traits like those weird incisors, they might
Mm-hmm.
not be for anything, right? We don't
Mm-hmm.
know the function of them, and they might be the result of natural selection working on some other trait that's linked to the regulatory gene, the EDAR gene, right? That ends up coding for teeth. So I think for me, it's going to be very interesting to find out what particular Neanderthal genes code for and how that is then manifest in what they look like.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll have more answers about that in the near future. We'll see.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. This concludes today's virtual program. Please join me in thanking Shara for sharing her work with us. And I'd also like to give special thanks to those who made this program possible, to our behind the scenes team who helped sort through your questions, including Dr. Ryan McRae from the Human Origins program here, to our donors, volunteers, and viewers like you, and finally to all our partners who help us reach, educate, and empower millions of people around the world today and every day. We thank you. We're taking a break next month, and we'll be back with a new season of Hot Topics next year, starting on February 20th. We've put a link in the Q&A where you can find information about our upcoming programs and how to sign up for the museum's weekly e-newsletter. That's the best way to stay informed about upcoming programs and to learn more about the museum's research and exhibitions. Right after this webinar ends, you'll see a survey pop up asking for some feedback about the program. Please take a moment to respond. We're very curious to know what topics you might be interested in seeing for future programs, and we appreciate your input. Again, thank you to our participants, thank you to the audience, and thank you to Shara. We'll see you next year.